My lords, a new threat is upon us. The Voidworm Plague has begun and is engulfing our galaxy in total war. Our people across the Commonwealth are being infected with the Voidworm parasites and subsumed into these disgusting creatures. It is not a problem that we face alone. Several weaker civilizations have already fallen to the infestation, and of course the Galcom debates endlessly. In this report, I shall discuss everything that we know about the Voidworms, including where they come from, their family dynamics and mating habits, their military capabilities, and most importantly, how to defeat them. But make no mistake, the fate of the Commonwealth will depend on this knowledge. Let us begin. Our first encounter with the Voidworms began when sensors indicated a presence in the Kepler 452 star system. This star system was sending rudimentary signals throughout the galaxy, and these same patterns had been registered on long-range scanners that originated from parts unknown. Though it was not clear whether these signals were intentional by nature, it did indeed warrant further investigation, and so Dr. Francesco Reddy, an expert xenobiologist, was sent to investigate. Dr. Reddy soon discovered that the far-reaching signals originated from a simple spaceborne organism that he would go on to designate as a voidworm. It appears that the galaxy is riddled with these creatures, and we somehow missed them during our previous exploration. From the varying wavelengths of the signals, Dr. Reddy has determined that the creatures develop through several stages of growth before reaching their final maturity. Though he reports that they do not appear outwardly aggressive, their patterns of communication do indicate coordination on a galactic scale. Dr. Reddy goes on to report that the creatures are parasitic, and they require planet-based organic hosts in order to reproduce. They have 4 growth stages. The Voidworms start as nymphs, which appear to be reasonably small, similar to a corvette in size, but they will soon grow into juveniles, which are closer to destroyers, and then eventually, some 180 months later, will mature into fully grown adults. Eventually, the adults will form a trocher. This is a never-ending perpetual mating ritual where 3 adult Voidworm will link together to form a single, large, symbiotically linked creature. Despite the perpetual mating, they still require an external, biological host in which to grow their offspring. Upon reaching adulthood, each Voidworm will develop a clutch of cysts within their reproductive system. These cysts contain a mix of highly caustic gametes. Adult Voidworms in trochers combine their gametes together and send them via spores onto planets with suitable biomass in the hope that the spores infect the planetside fauna, and once the host is infected, they will eventually die and spawn a baby Voidworm, i.e. a nymph. When these nymphs burst free from their hosts, they will enter into space and make their way back to the Voidworm nests, which are situated in black hole systems. It is here in the safety of their nesting systems that they will mature into juvenile Voidworms. Juveniles are far more active, and they will leave the safety of the nest and go scouting for suitable target worlds ripe for infestation. Once the juveniles identify potential targets, they return to the nest and direct the adult troikers to their locations. The troikers will move in and bombard the planet with spores, and thus the cycle of life continues. Most interestingly, Dr. Reddy reports that there is clear evidence that these Voidworms coordinate their bombardments as so to maintain a sustainable number of viable hosts throughout the galaxy. It would appear that these creatures are intelligent enough to not wantonly consume, but equally, it would appear that we are like cattle to them. Furthermore, Dr. Reddy believes that we can harness the power of their reproductive enzymes to our own benefit, and we may even be able to develop an immunity to their reproductive spores. This research took several years, but we did manage to find a suitable solution to the Voidworm spawn problem. Our colonies are now protected and are totally immune to their spores. We created an aerosol which neutralizes their spores as soon as they enter our atmosphere. It also had a side benefit of increasing our understanding of their biology, and will lead us to be able to inflict more damage upon them should we need to. And this was the state of the galaxy for several decades. The Voidworms learned to leave us alone as they could no longer use our planet or population to reproduce. However, not all in the galaxy was so fortunate. The Voidworms continued to harass the galactic populace, and, most importantly, their colonies continued to grow in size until they reached a critical mass, and this critical mass would lead to the Voidworm Plague. Dr. Reddy now reports on the Voidworm Plague. The population of the Voidworms in the galaxy reached a critical mass. Their behaviour noticeably changed. The typical stage of their life cycle where host populations would be spared was disrupted, and there now seemed to be complete disregard for the sustainability of their spawning grounds. The Voidworms were grouping en masse and attacking colonies with an aggression hitherto unseen. All Commonwealth colonies were put on red alert, and the movement of presence of any Voidworm was flagged and marked as an extreme danger. A breeding frenzy on a scale never witnessed before was about to befall the galaxy. Furthermore, we would soon find out that the cure that once protected us from their reproductive spores was no longer functioning, and we needed to go back to the drawing board. We had several options available to us. We could attempt to search for a new cure, essentially a repeat of what we had already tried, but this time we would attempt to chemically neuter their population rather than just protect our own planets. This would mean that the Voidworms would no longer be able to reproduce in our galaxy, and in theory, eventually die out. We could of course attempt to purge the Voidworms with good old-fashioned fire and flame. We could set our colonies on a military footing and shift our military production into overdrive. This would result in an unhappy population for a while, but I'm sure that they would prefer a few years of hard living than becoming the host for a parasitic space worm. At least I would hope. A third solution would be to kill our infected populace. We would set up strict quarantine and kill orders on any human that showed signs of parasitic infection. This would prevent the spread and reproduction of the Voidworms in our own systems, but I cannot imagine this going down too well across the Commonwealth. It's also clearly not a final solution, and we will eventually run out of people to purge. The final option available to us is that we could simply just do nothing. There are other empires out there after all, perhaps they should save the galaxy for a change. I felt at the time that despite the fact that we had 4 available options, 3 were viable and really should be used in conjunction with one another. We will attempt to find a biological cure to a biological problem, and in the meantime we will strengthen our starbases and fleets. We will also seek out and purge infected citizens where required. We intend to understand how the Voidworms are built so that we can develop a ship design to counter them, and furthermore we understand that destroying their nesting grounds will almost certainly hurt their attempts to breed. These should be key targets for our fleets. And so this is what we began to do, and continued this way for some time, holding our ground. But eventually, our Kepler 5b colony came under attack. A large group of Voidworms came in system and quickly overwhelmed the defensive starbase. They entered the orbit of the colony and began bombarding it with parasitic cysts. Biological analysis indicated that each clutch of Voidworms had a limited supply of the cysts to distribute, and it was likely that they would depart once these cysts were depleted. Sadly, until then, the planet would suffer a significant population loss. We did learn, however, that each cyst contained a toxic spore that was extremely deadly not only to our colonists, but all life. The cysts were airborne, and once ingested, would rapidly gestate into a nymph that will emerge violently and completely destroy its host. The nymphs contained a bladder of compressed gases that allowed them to ascend into the upper atmosphere, where they instinctively propelled themselves to a predetermined destination, likely their nesting grounds. It was very disturbing indeed. While these events were occurring, the ever-useful Galcom passed the Voidworm Eradication Resolution. The Galcom declared that all Voidworms were no longer permitted within member nation systems. Until they are eliminated or leave space of their own accord, the Empire allowing them in their systems will be considered in breach of galactic law. This law makes us legally obligated to immediately euthanize any Voidworms present within our borders. If we do not deal with infestation immediately, members of the Galcom will impose sanctions upon us. We found this fairly amusing, given that there was a galactic crisis present and the Galcom wanted to impose sanctions upon those trying to fight it. Politics, indeed. During this time of crisis, as you can imagine, various events occurred, and I shall detail some of the more important ones for you now. Initially, our war efforts went well, and our increased fleet support in efforts against the Voidworms yielded an unexpected windfall of additional components due to improved maintenance protocols. We had an opportunity to invest these materials into improving our short-term production of new fleets, and further to this, continued preparations against the Voidworm menace inspired a new generation of commanders. Experienced citizens chose to offer their talents towards the elimination of the galactic threat, and if that wasn't enough, an ambitious engineer stationed on Unity developed a new conceptual blueprint for ship defences. This engineer was carrying out routine repairs in the fight against the Voidworms when he came up with a new idea for a component that would increase the hardiness of our vessels. After the idea was presented to the research team, they tell me it has great potential. However, despite these positives, our people suffered. It was not long into the plague before we suffered a quarantine breach. A small group of infected on Alpha Centauri fled from the purge and dispersed across the planet. Left unchecked, we think that this could cause the infection to spread across the planet. Obviously, these citizens must be dealt with before they endanger the world. However, the soldiers ordered to carry out the purge are having difficulties. While we universally agree that purging the infected is a wise course of action, many of the soldiers on the ground are struggling to carry out the orders. Despite the danger of the parasite, many are simply unable to eliminate their fellow citizens for the greater good. To solve this problem, we intend to develop an automated method for purging, perhaps via some sort of drone technology. Meanwhile, we will launch a publicity campaign to promote the ethical standards of our purging efforts and reaffirm its necessity. In the dark depths of space, our fleets would hold the Voidworms at bay, and our soldiers on the ground would gallantly deal with the infected, and this was the state of play for several years. Other empires would lose colonies to the beasts, but the Commonwealth survived. And while all of this was going on, our biologists were hard at work trying to design a method in which to deal with the Voidworm menace once and for all. The cure. In time, our understanding of the Voidworm Plague improved, and the foundation of a cure began to be developed. However, we soon established that our research could progress at a much faster pace with early-stage live testing on human participants. Ethical considerations aside, it was thought that it might be wiser to bypass certain safety methods for the sake of the greater good. Given the threat, we decided to allow biological testing on volunteers only, and ensured that they and/or their families would be extremely well compensated for their sacrifice. This approach was a success, as we discovered a pattern in the reproduction cycle of the Voidworms that could lead to a huge breakthrough in synthesizing a cure to the plague. To confirm this hypothesis, the reproductive glands of a wild adult Voidworm were acquired in order to test our would-be cure. But crucially, this adult worm must be killed while bombarding a planet in order to preserve its active reproductive gametes. It was not untypical from our science team requiring the most awkward methods to achieve their goals. Thus, we deliberately vacated the redacted from the record star system, which contained 2 inhabited planets. All system defense forces were removed. Essentially, these 2 planets were to be partially sacrificed in the hope that we could gather the specimens that we required. The trap was set, and the project went as intended. A swarm of Voidworm entered the system and began to bombard the planet with their deadly reproductive spores. Our task force in wait did not take long to swoop in and slaughter them mid-bombardment. We were successful in recovering the glands, but almost certainly at the cost of some of the population on the planets below. The glands that we managed to recover from the fertile Voidworm troika revealed new information about their reproductive cycles. Locked in their mating ritual until death, each of the 3 Voidworms in the troikas distribute their genetic material equally between themselves, effectively becoming a new organism entirely. Our science team was able to use these processes of genetic malleability against them. And finally, several years after this ordeal began, I am most pleased to report that our biologists have completed the development of the ultimate cure to the voidworm parasitic infection. Our colonies are no longer susceptible to their spore bombardments, and we need no longer be concerned about their presence in the galaxy. Our science teams are now certain that this time, the cure that we have developed is safeguarded against any future mutation of their biology. And so, my lords, I am pleased to report that our colonies and our people are safe from the threat of the worm bombardment. However, we should still be wary should we meet any of these creatures in the dark depths of space. And we can still assist the galaxy in their purge if we wish. Thus, I will spend the next few minutes discussing the best way to defeat the Voidworm menace in ship-to-ship combat. As you've learnt from this report, Voidworms come in 4 forms, and we'll start with the weakest and move through to the strongest. The nymphs are the weakest, and they are slightly stronger than an average corvette. They have a hull rating of 400, no armour and no shields. Like corvettes, they are remarkably evasive, and they will use a mix of spike spores, which is an organic torpedo, which penetrates shields, and their sharp teeth, which will penetrate both shields and armour. Given their weapons, using shields will be useless against them. I would recommend to outfit your ships with armour and reinforce your hull where possible. Furthermore, you should equip your ships with weapons that do bonus damage to hull, such as lasers and plasma. Moving on to the juveniles. These are essentially the same as nymphs, but larger. They have a hull rating of 800, and their skin has toughened to form a basic armour. These creatures are most similar to destroyers in terms of tonnage, and they use the same weapons as the nymph counterparts, torpedoes and teeth. As such, the advice is the same. Shield your ships with sufficient armour, and use weapons that bust through armour, such as plasma and laser. Onto the adults, and as expected the pattern is similar. However, adults are as large, if not slightly larger, than an advanced battleship, coming in at a whopping 4,000 hull points. For reference, a standard Commonwealth battleship has only 3,600 hull points, even when fully upgraded. Adult Voidworms have a toughened outer shell, and their organic weapons are significantly more powerful than the nymphs and the juveniles. Do not underestimate the threat that these worms in adult form represent. Several of them could easily overwhelm an equal number of cruisers or even battleships when outnumbered. And finally, the most advanced type, the Troika. This is 3 adult Voidworms combined, and they have the numbers to match. The Troika weighs in at a whopping 12,000 hull points and 3,000 armour. They have 7 spike spores and 3 Voidworm fangs between them, which they will use to great effect to rend your ships apart. The Voidworms are not to be underestimated. Underprepared and ill-equipped ships will be dominated by swarms of these during an outbreak of the Voidworm Plague. The advice remains the same. Fit your ships with armour and armour-busting weapons, and do not get overconfident. The final point is that point defence and strikecraft wouldn't be the worst choice if you're using battleships, given the Voidworm over-reliance on torpedoes. The final thing to note is regarding the Voidworm nest. These nests are only present in black hole systems, so beware when exploring them for the first time. But do not underestimate their power. They are riddled with spike spore launchers, and will attempt to overwhelm your point defence with hordes of torpedoes. Prepare accordingly. Despite the threat the Voidworms represent, I believe that they can be managed. Best of luck, my lords. Lead your people to victory. Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you enjoy Grand Archive, and as ever, if you want to hear more from me, please click the video on screen now.